All right, what is going on, guys? Today's video is going to be about tariffs. So right now, at the time I'm making this video, everybody's talking about tariffs, and how right now in China, we've got these tariffs going on and everybody's freaking out. There's this panic. They're talking about how the sky is falling. Nobody else can make products apparently outside of China. The prices of everything are just going to skyrocket. 140% tariff. You're just going to see prices of everything go up by multiple times. That's at least how people are acting, right? So I'm going to break this down for this stuff and for all this fear and the panic and all the news that's going on. Is there truth to any of it? And what are the ways to beat the tariffs? So this is how to beat tariffs in 2025. Let's get to it. Go ahead and pull this up right here. All right, so first, we got to understand what a tariff actually is. So there's a lot of confusion about these tariffs where people are making posts and they'll say things like, oh, if there's a 140% tariff on iPhones or whatever product it is, that means the price of iPhones is going to go up by 140%. Is it though? Is it necessarily going to go up by 140%? I don't know. I can't predict the future and I can't tell you what will happen, but what I can tell you is that a 140% tariff is not a 140% tariff on the sale price. So Apple, for example, let's just use this as an example. Let's say they're getting these iPhones. I don't know exactly what their cost of goods is, but let's say it's under $100. Realistically, they're probably at least, it may be much, much greater than this, honestly, but they're probably at least about a 10x multiplier or more for their cost of goods with a brand of their scale, right? Because companies at that size can invest billions and billions of dollars into figuring out how to lower their cost of goods down as low as possible because it is a big expense. Don't get me wrong. And typically, a lot of companies shoot for trying to be at it anywhere from a 5 to a 7x or greater multiplier when they're looking at their cost of goods, the total cost that they have in the product. So it varies depending on who you ask, depending on what you're selling on and what your fees are and everything else that goes into it. It's going to vary, right? But ideally, if you are adding up your cost of goods, plus whatever shipping and freight costs and stuff you've got into your product, and let's say your product costs you $5 with all that included, and you're able to sell it for $35 and it's good quality, the quality is great and everything. Typically that's pretty good, right? So anyways, Apple, let's say they've got these iPhones, right? And they're getting them for less than $100 each. Let's just say for the sake of math, they're selling them for $1,000. Okay? Just for the sake of math, so Apple is selling their iPhones for $1,000. They're getting them for, we'll call it $100. Just for the sake of this example. Now, like I've said, I don't know what their cost of goods is, but we're just going to use this for the sake of math. If you have a 140% tariff, if you have a 140% tariff, that cost that they pay would go up from $100 to $240. It's not going to go up by $2,400 or $1,400 or anything crazy like that. It would go up by $140 with a 140% tariff. Now, yes, that would still be a significant increase to the cost of goods if they did not figure out a way to get around that. Now, companies of Apple's size, for example, what they can do is they can relocate to somewhere else. So, option number one for avoiding the tariffs altogether would be to move your manufacturing for whatever product it is. Some people, it may be a smaller manufacturer where you're getting a product made overseas, and maybe that's the lowest cost per unit way to do it, or that's just the way you've been taught. So maybe you have a lower cost per unit to make the product overseas, but your shipping costs are outrageous now because of these tariffs. You see, because the tariff doesn't apply to the cost of goods. The tariff doesn't change the cost of goods. If anything, it might give you a little bit of leverage to negotiate a lower cost of goods. The tariff doesn't actually change the cost of goods from the manufacturer. The tariff will typically change the shipping cost, not the cost of goods, which could be factored in when you're calculating your total cost of goods, but it doesn't change the cost of goods directly from that manufacturer in most cases that I'm aware of. So if you want to lower your total cost of goods, which obviously you have to factor in the tariffs and the fees and stuff if you want to accurately track your cost of goods in any meaningful way, one way you could lower your cost of goods when including the shipping and the tariffs and everything else would be just to move manufacturing to the United States. So yes, labor costs are typically going to be higher. So one of the pros here are potentially lower shipping costs, which could in theory lower your cost of goods possibly. Your lead times may be faster if you're working with the U.S. manufacturer and you don't have to wait on the long shipping. You could support USA businesses if that's your thing. You don't have the language barrier of dealing with somebody who speaks a foreign language, and there's more accountability. So if you can go to a manufacturing place in person, or they're a physical business in the U.S., there's going to be some more accountability there versus some overseas manufacturer who you never can really visit. So let's say, for example, we'll just use this to be hyperbolic. So you got a product right now, and it costs you $3 from your manufacturer in China who's currently making the product that you sell. Maybe you sell it on Amazon, whatever, right? So you have your manufacturer. It costs you $3 to make the product. Now, on the other hand, you could make this same product maybe for $4, $4.50, whatever it may be in the US. But one, your shipping costs are higher with dealing with China, because obviously, one, China is going to be farther away from the United States if you're located in the United States, so your shipping costs may be higher just because of that. But two, you've also got the tariffs, right? So if you got a 140% tariff and your cost of goods is $3, you may be adding another, just doing the math off the top of my head, another roughly $4 or more in cost of goods just from the tariffs that you could potentially avoid by switching to the US. So in some circumstances, even if your cost of goods from your manufacturer is a little bit higher in the US, there might be some avenue where it makes sense to transition, even for a smaller business, to made in the USA. Now, typically, I would say, really, it's going to depend on your category. It'll depend on what you're selling. It'll depend on if you could invest, for example, in new tooling. If you're selling like an injection molded product and maybe you needed new tooling, well, then again, there might be another route to be able to do something like that too, depending on the manufacturer and what they're willing to do. So it really depends here. Now, this option wouldn't be for everybody, and the cons would be you might be paying a little bit more for the cost of goods for the product, especially given the fact that labor costs are typically going to be higher relative to other countries here in the United States. And then you also have the subsidy programs and all kinds of other stuff in places like China. So that's the first thing you got to keep in mind if you did this, is you could raise your cost of goods, but it could actually lower your total cost of goods whenever you're accounting for everything else. It really just depends. So make sure you do the math and break everything down if that was something you're going to do. But typically, I'd say this may make more sense if you are a larger business. You're a multi-billion-dollar business and you have the funds to be able to set up a new factory for whatever it is that you're selling here in the U.S. That might make more sense. Or if there's some route where maybe you could set up the machines and stuff and do the manufacturing yourself, whatever it may be. There may be some option that might make sense for some businesses to do this. All right, so the second thing here, this is option number 2. This one would be a little bit simpler. Now, you could find a more cost-effective freight forwarding service, or just reduce your shipping costs altogether, because the tariff is being applied on the shipping cost. So what could you do to reduce your shipping costs? So maybe you're shipping less than container loads. So when you ship by sea, now, by the way, I'm not an expert specifically in shipping. I'm just speaking from experience, from what I've seen. Typically, if you're shipping a partial container versus a full container, the cost to ship that would be higher. So you could do things like shipping a full container at a time instead of a partial, figuring out a way to do that. Ship slow sea instead of fast sea. So you're placing the order sooner, but you're using a slower shipping method to try to offset that added cost some. And then maybe combined with that, you could negotiate, a little bit with the manufacturer and say, hey, look, here's the tariff situation. What can you do for me on pricing to reduce this cost of goods so that I can keep doing business with you? And by the way, if there is a little bit of leverage there of, hey, I could move my production to somewhere else and get a much cheaper cost, they may be a little bit more willing to give you favorable pricing. Now, you still want to be, respectful and everything, but let's be honest here. If they have a customer that they want to keep, and you are doing business in China where many people are leaving, they're going to other countries to have their products made and stuff, moving to the United States, wherever. If they want to keep your business, they may be willing to, eat some of that tariff cost essentially for you to keep your business. So there may be some negotiation room there if you know how to negotiate with the manufacturer to reduce that cost of goods, or just indirectly reducing the shipping cost. So the way I would, reduce the shipping cost is I would go onto a shipping site like FreightOS, where you have a database of all these different freight forwarders. Go in, input your product dimensions, your weights and everything else on there. And then from there, you can compare prices of many different freight forwarders. And a pro tip here is you could even contact them outside of FreightOS if you really wanted to save even more money, right? So you could use FreightOS for convenience sake, or if you really wanted to try to negotiate and lower the cost even more, you could try to contact them outside of there as well. So there's stuff like that you can do to reduce your cost of goods as well. Now, what's option number 3? Relocate to another country. So to be honest with you, this is probably going to be my favorite one of the 3 that I've covered. For if you were having a product made in, say, China, for example, and you've got this big tariff that you're trying to avoid. So the pros here, you can have labor costs that can be very, very low. A lot of people think, oh, well, China is the cheapest place to make something. Not necessarily true. There's countries where you can get good quality products, from other countries. It's not like China is the only country that can make products. You can get good quality products from other countries outside of China, and it may even be cheaper than what you're paying. I'll give you this example. I just got a quote from, for this company that I do some, business stuff for, and I'm not going to say their exact price, but they have this plastic product. It's kind of like a bottle type deal, and this product was costing them about 2 to 3 times as much, not even counting for the tariffs, just the cost of goods alone. To make this product in China with the current manufacturer, who I felt was probably charging them too much, it's 2 to 3 times as expensive as the one quote that we got. We've only had one quote so far. The one quote that we got in India was 1/2 to 1/3 roughly of what they are currently paying. And this is somebody they've been doing business with for years. Think about that, for example. China is not always the cheapest place to make products. A lot of people think that you have to get the product made in China for it to be cheap, or they think that because something is cheap, that it means it's worse quality. That's not always the case either, right? So they think because they pay more for something, it makes it better quality. They get these t-shirts, for example. You got a guy who maybe he's selling t-shirts and he pays $10 a shirt for them. And he thinks because he pays $10 that's because they're the best quality t-shirts, when really he's buying them through a middleman who probably gets them for $2, for example. And it's the same shirt that he would be paying $2 for if he would go direct to the manufacturer. So that is just something. Point in saying all this, the world is not going to end if prices increase in China. The only way that happens is if nobody adapts. If you just allow this stuff to cause you to just stay stagnant and you don't do anything to change anything else, maybe there will be some negative effect. But the reality is you don't have to do that. There's options out there and there's different ways you can potentially beat these tariffs if you wanted to. So just feel free to, if you're somebody who's trying to figure out what to do in this situation, feel free to explore your different options. Now, I would say if you end up going the route of changing production out of China to another Southeast Asian country, maybe somewhere like, somewhere in Southeast Asia, like India. You could go to India, for example. India actually has, statistically speaking, lower labor cost than China. Much lower labor cost than China. So India has some of the lowest labor cost in the world, in the manufacturing space, and they are a big competitor of China. So you can find a good manufacturer in somewhere like India, for example. Or you could go somewhere else. You could go to somewhere like Taiwan, for instance. There's all kinds of other places that do manufacturing, is my point, and you can get competitive pricing that's relatively similar to what you pay now before the tariffs, most likely in a different country. Yes, it might be a little bit of a struggle to have to, move production to somewhere else. There may be some temporary pain involved with that, but you have to adapt at the end of the day. So anyways, last but not least, this is the last way I would say where if you're trying to beat these tariffs, yes, you could also look at other expenses and say, you know what? Well, our cost of goods has gone up, so we need to make our advertising more efficient, or we need to cut out this expense. That's a percentage of our sales, or whatever it may be. You could look at other expenses too to try to offset that, right? And there may be other things that you could look at, like, for example, maybe right now your cost per purchase, your blended CPA, is a $30. And with these tariffs coming into effect, it's going to raise your cost of goods some if you don't change anything. And maybe you don't want to change anything, or whatever it may be. For some reason, you don't want to change anything else. You say, well, okay, we need to make sure we can get our cost per purchase down to 25 or whatever it may be to try to somewhat offset this added expense. So then you could look at ways to lower your cost per purchase as well. So maybe you build out some email flows to try to make your marketing efforts more efficient if you don't have those email flows. There could be stuff like that. Do some websites here or whatever it is. Test a new offer, increase your AOV. There's all kinds of other stuff where you could potentially offset that. If it's not a massive increase in your cost of goods, or even if it is, there may be ways to offset that, by combining some of these potential options, some of these potential things that you could do that I've listed, or other stuff maybe that I have not listed. So anyways, that is about it for this video. Those are just a few different ways that you could potentially beat the tariff situation that is currently going on right now at the time I'm making this video. And then, last but not least, I would say another option is you could potentially raise your prices if you really wanted to. So in some businesses that might not make sense. Apple, for example, people may say, well, the prices of iPhones are going to go up drastically. Do you really think that a company of their size has not ran price tests on their website to find out what the optimal price to sell their product at is? So if Apple comes in and they say, oh, well, I'm just going to raise my prices. We're going to just bump our prices up. Our cost of goods goes up by 140% because of this tariff. So we're just going to raise our prices by 140%. Do you think Apple's going to stay in business? Are they going to sell the same amount of iPhones? I doubt it. I would be willing to bet you they have done extensive price testing on this stuff already. And they know if they were to raise their price, probably even like $1 more, that they're going to see some kind of drop off. So they have these very, very smart people who know how to do all this testing and stuff. And companies of their size, you would bet your bottom dollar, they are running price tests. They have tested prices. They have done research and stuff to try to figure out how to price their product when you have a multi-billion-dollar company of their size, especially. So anyways, that's about what I've got for now. That's kind of my prediction on the whole tariff thing. I don't think we're going to see some kind of drastic price change. Yes, prices on some stuff may increase a little, but the market will adapt. If people increase their prices and then people stop buying those specific products because they see their prices went way up, for example, then the market behavior may change. So those people may realize if people stop buying the product at that higher price, they may have to adapt too. So it's not this simple thing of, well, the consumer is always going to be the one who pays for the tariff. It can be a lot more complicated than that, is my point. So anyways, if you like this video, found it helpful, maybe you got some value from it, feel free to leave a comment below. If you think that my opinion on tariffs is trash, let me know as well. But anyways, that is my opinion on tariffs and ways that you could potentially beat the tariffs in 2025.